Rebecca Thompson had never believed in signs of fate. Yet, that November afternoon, as she stood in the dusty attic of her mother's house, her hands covered in dust, and her eyes still swollen from unshed tears, she felt something break inside her. It wasn't just the pain of recent loss. It was something older, deeper, something that had to do with the small, brown, leather-bound journal she held in her trembling hands. The diary bore a date engraved in faded gold on the spine, 1987, the year her parents got married. Rebecca hadn't even known her mother, Catherine, kept a diary. Catherine Thompson had always been a reserved, pragmatic woman, the kind of person who faced life with determination and few words. Yet there it was, hidden among unopened Christmas boxes and old clothes that smelled of mothballs and forgotten memories. Rebecca sat on the cool attic floor, the autumn light filtering faintly through a small circular window. Her fingers brushed the worn blanket. 3 weeks ago, she had discovered that her husband, Marcus, had cheated on her. Not a single night of weakness, not a mistake. 2 years. 2 years of lies, of invented dinners, of work weekends that never existed. 2 years of another life, parallel, hidden, built while she cooked dinner and waited for him to come home. And now her mother was dead. A sudden heart attack, the doctors had said. No warning. Catherine had passed away while she was watering the roses in the backyard, in that small town on the outskirts of Portland where Rebecca had grown up. Rebecca had arrived too late. She had found her mother lying on the grass, the hose still in her hand, and her eyes closed, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Now, 3 weeks later, Rebecca was alone in that silent house, tasked with emptying it, selling it, closing a chapter she'd never wanted to close. Her father had died 10 years earlier. There were no siblings. There was no one. Just her, the boxes, and the unbearable weight of 2 overlapping losses, that of her mother, and that of the marriage she'd believed in. Rebecca opened the diary. The pages were yellowed, her mother's handwriting elegant and precise. The first lines spoke of happiness, of a new marriage, of shared dreams, of a home to build together. Rebecca smiled faintly. Her mother wrote about her father with affection, with hope. It all seemed so perfect. But then, as I slowly leafed through the pages, something changed. The handwriting remained the same, but the tone did not. Around 1989, the words began to grow heavier. Catherine wrote of silences, of a husband who came home later and later, of eyes that no longer sought her out, of a loneliness growing within the walls of a home that should have been filled with love. Rebecca felt her breath catch. She continued reading, page after page, and the tears began to fall without her realizing it. Her mother had suffered. Her mother had felt exactly what Rebecca was feeling now. The same loneliness, the same emptiness, the same feeling of being invisible. And if you believe that sometimes the past holds the answers we need for the future, subscribe to listen to this story until the end. Rebecca closed her eyes. Her hands were still shaking. She didn't know if she had the strength to continue reading, but something inside her told her she had to. That in those pages was something her mother had wanted to leave her, something that would change everything. 2 weeks before finding the diary, Rebecca Thompson still believed she had a life. Not perfect, perhaps. Not like in the movies, but hers. Real. Stable. She and Marcus had been married for 8 years. 8 years of shared routine, of quiet but comfortable dinners, of projects halfway between dream and resignation. Rebecca worked as a freelance graphic designer from home. Marcus was a financial consultant, always running to meetings, always on the phone, always busy. She had learned not to ask for too much, not to expect too much. That Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca had finished earlier than expected. A client had canceled a call at the last minute, and she'd found herself with a rare afternoon free. She'd thought about surprising Marcus, maybe cooking something special, maybe watching a movie together, like they'd done in the beginning, maybe rediscovering the bond that had seemed lost in the empty hallways of their oversized house over the past few months. When she entered, the house was quiet. Marcus must have been in the bedroom, perhaps resting. He'd said he hadn't felt well the night before. Rebecca placed the shopping bags on the kitchen counter, took off her shoes, and climbed the stairs quietly, without making any noise. She wanted to surprise him. She pushed open the bedroom door. Marcus was asleep. His phone, however, was on the nightstand. On. The screen lit up every few seconds with notifications. Rebecca wasn't the type of woman to check her husband's phones. She never had. But that evening, something made her lean closer. Maybe it was yet another dinner eaten alone. Maybe it was all those times he'd said he was tired, too tired even to talk. The phone wasn't locked. Marcus had left it open, probably falling asleep before closing it. Rebecca looked at the screen. There were messages. Lots of them. All from the same person. A name she didn't recognize. Jenna. I can't wait to see you tomorrow. I miss you already. Did you tell her you're working late? My love, these 2 years together have been the most beautiful of my life. Rebecca felt the floor slip beneath her. 2 years. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-night stand. It was a parallel life. A complete relationship. With promises. With plans. With a future Marcus was building while she waited for him to come home. Her hands shook. She kept scrolling. Photographs. Dinners at restaurants she recognized but had never been to. Weekends out of town that Marcus had told her were business trips. Love messages. Messages in which he talked about leaving Rebecca. Soon, love. I'm just waiting for the right moment. Rebecca placed the phone exactly where she'd found it. She didn't scream. She didn't wake him. She didn't break anything. She just felt an immense emptiness expanding inside her, as if someone had ripped out her lungs. She went down the stairs in silence. She went to the hallway closet, grabbed a large suitcase, and began packing it with Marcus's clothes. Shirts, pants, shoes, everything. Methodically. Without haste. Without anger. Only with a pain so deep that it left no room for anything else. By the time she finished, it was almost 8 o'clock in the evening. The oven was still on. The chicken she'd planned to cook for them was there. Raw. Useless. Rebecca turned everything off. She dragged her suitcase to the entrance and left it in front of the door. Then she grabbed her car keys and left. She didn't know where to go. She drove aimlessly for hours, crossing streets she knew by heart, but that evening seemed foreign to her. Finally, she stopped in an empty parking lot near a closed supermarket. She turned off the engine, and only then, in the complete silence, did she begin to cry. Rebecca Thompson didn't return home that night. Not the next. Not the one after that. She checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, a nondescript place where no one asked questions and where she could remain invisible. But after 3 days, when cash began to run low and reality became more pressing, she realized she couldn't keep running. She had to go somewhere, a place where she could think, where she could exist without feeling watched. Her mother's house had been empty for 3 weeks now. Catherine was dead, and no one lived there anymore. Rebecca still had the keys. That house in the quiet suburbs of Portland, with its small backyard and porch where her mother sat every afternoon reading, was the only place that seemed far enough away from her grief, safe enough. By the time she arrived, it was already evening. The streetlights illuminated the deserted road. Rebecca parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the front door. She knew that as soon as she crossed that threshold, everything would become real. Her mother's death, the end of her marriage, the absolute loneliness that awaited her on the other side. Finally, she came downstairs. She opened the door with still shaking hands. The smell of the house hit her immediately, a mix of old wood, lavender, and something indefinable that belonged only to her mother. Rebecca turned on the hallway light. Everything was exactly as Catherine had left it. The slippers by the door, the jacket hanging on the coat rack, a forgotten cup of tea on the coffee table, now empty and with a dry stain on the bottom. Rebecca put down her bag and looked around. The house was full of memories, but now each memory seemed to carry an unbearable weight. She sat on the couch, in the same spot where her mother always sat, and felt the tears return. She cried silently, her face in her hands, trying to stifle her sobs, because even in that empty house, she felt ashamed of her pain. The days began to pass in a routine of torpor. Rebecca woke up late, not knowing what day it was. She spent hours moving boxes from one room to another, opening drawers full of photographs and letters she didn't have the strength to read. She avoided looking in the mirror. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't comb her hair. She ate little, only when her stomach reminded her, and always the same things: toast, fruit, a few cookies found in her mother's pantry. Every evening, Rebecca sat in the kitchen where Catherine made coffee every morning. It was a small kitchen, with blue and white tiles, a round wooden table, and a window overlooking the garden. Rebecca sat there, in the darkness, and listened to the silence. A silence that wasn't peace. It was absence. It was emptiness. It was the sound of a life that had stopped and no longer knew how to begin again. Marcus had tried calling her, many times. Rebecca didn't answer. She'd read some of his messages. All the same. Empty apologies. Delayed promises. The usual litany of those who have been discovered and are desperately trying to put the pieces back together, not realizing there's nothing left to save. Rebecca deleted the messages without responding. There was nothing left to say. One night, as she lay sleepless in her mother's bed, Rebecca looked at her left hand. The wedding ring glowed faintly in the dim light. She stared at it for a long time. She couldn't take it off. Not yet. Not because she wanted to go back to Marcus, but because taking it off would mean admitting that everything was over, that 8 years of her life had been a lie, that she hadn't known how to see. She hadn't known how to protect herself. The ring weighed. It weighed like a chain. It weighed like all the unspoken words, all the unasked questions, all the ignored signals. Rebecca closed her eyes. She tried to sleep, but sleep never truly came, and when it did, it brought only nightmares. It was during one of those aimless afternoons that Rebecca found herself climbing the narrow staircase that led to the attic. She didn't even know why she was doing it. Maybe because she had already searched every corner of the house, and the attic was the last place left. Maybe because she was looking for something that would give her meaning, direction, a reason to keep breathing. The attic was small, with a low ceiling, dark wooden beams, and a single round window that let in a pale, dusty light. There were boxes everywhere. Christmas boxes with decorations that no one would ever hang again. Boxes of clothes her mother had never had the courage to throw away. Boxes of photographs, diplomas, memories of a lifetime sealed in cardboard and duct tape. Rebecca knelt before one of the older boxes, the one with the faded label that simply said, 80s inside, were her mother's clothes. Long skirts, lace blouses, a gray wool coat Rebecca vaguely remembered. Underneath the clothes, wrapped in a blue silk handkerchief, was something smaller. He carefully pulled it out. It was a diary, bound in worn brown leather, with yellowed pages and a small brass clasp that opened easily. On the spine, stamped in faded gold, was the date, 1987. Rebecca sat on the cold floor. Her hands shook as she opened the diary. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't even know if she wanted to read. But something compelled her to do so, something stronger than fear. The first pages were filled with excitement. Catherine wrote about her wedding, about the white dress she and her mother had chosen, about the small but loving ceremony, about their honeymoon in a coastal town. She wrote about Rebecca's father, about how kind he was, how much he made her laugh. I feel lucky, Catherine had written. I feel seen. Rebecca smiled faintly. She had never thought of her parents that way, as young people, in love, full of hope. She had always known them only as parents, adults, stable, immutable figures. But then, slowly leafing through the pages, something changed. The handwriting remained the same, precise and elegant, but the tone did not. Around 1989, the words began to grow darker. Catherine wrote of silences, of a husband who returned later and later, of dinners eaten alone, of nights when she fell asleep hugging her pillow because he wasn't there. I don't know who I am to him anymore, Catherine had written on a page dated April 1989. He looks at me, but he doesn't see me. He talks to me, but he doesn't listen. He's here, but he's somewhere else. And I feel like I'm disappearing. Rebecca felt her breath catch. Those words, those exact words were the ones she'd felt inside herself over the past few months with Marcus. They were the same feelings, the same loneliness, the same dull, constant ache of being invisible to the person who should have loved you more than anyone else. She continued reading. The pages grew heavier and heavier. Catherine spoke of doubts, of fears, of sleepless nights. Rebecca realized with a shiver running down her spine that her mother wasn't just writing about loneliness. She was writing about something else, something Rebecca had never imagined. She turned the page, and there, written in a hand more shaky than usual, was a sentence that took her breath away. I found a letter. It wasn't for me. Rebecca froze. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to put the diary on her knees. Her mother had discovered something that had changed everything. Rebecca couldn't take her eyes off that sentence. I found a letter. It wasn't for me. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, as if they still carried with them all the weight of the pain her mother had felt while writing them. Rebecca turned the page, her hands shaking so hard they rustled the yellowed paper. What followed was written in a different hand, more hurried, more desperate, as if Catherine had to write quickly, before the pain completely overwhelmed her. The date was June 1989. I found it in his jacket pocket. I was packing his clothes for the laundry and the envelope fell out. It was open. I shouldn't have read it, I know, but I did. And now I wish I'd never read it, because I can't go back. I can't pretend I didn't know anymore. Rebecca felt her heart race. She continued reading, tears already beginning to blur her vision. Her name's Linda. She works with him. The letter was about a weekend together, about a hotel, about promises. He told her he was leaving me, that he was just waiting for the right moment, as if there was a right moment to destroy a life. Rebecca had to stop. She placed the diary on her knees and covered her face with her hands. Her mother had experienced exactly what she was experiencing now. The same betrayal, the same accidental discovery, the same feeling of having been replaced, erased, rendered invisible by someone who had sworn to love her forever. She took a deep breath and continued reading. Catherine described the days following the discovery, how she'd waited for her husband to come home, how she'd said nothing, how she'd watched him eat dinner, talk about work, smile, while everything inside her was crumbling. She'd waited 3 days before facing it, 3 days of silence and suppressed pain. When I told him, he didn't even deny it. He just looked down. He said it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that he still loved me. But I saw his eyes, and in those eyes there was no love. There was only the fear of losing the comfortable life he had built. Rebecca felt a pang in her chest. Those words could have been hers. They could have perfectly described Marcus. The same fear, the same empty desperation, the same inability to see the other person's pain. But what followed was something Rebecca hadn't expected. Catherine had made a decision her daughter would never have imagined. I left. I packed my bags while he was sleeping and left. I went to Aunt Margaret's 2 hours away. I told her everything. She didn't ask any questions. She just hugged me and made me tea. I stayed there for 6 months. 6 months of trying to figure out who I was without him. 6 months of learning to breathe again. Rebecca stood still. Her mother was gone. She had left her father, and she had never known. How was it possible? How could she not have known? But then she realized that when it had happened, she hadn't even been born yet. Catherine had gotten pregnant after she returned. She continued reading, her heart pounding. Catherine described those 6 months with painful precision. The loneliness, the sense of failure, but also something else. A slow rebuilding, morning walks, books read late, conversations with Aunt Margaret that reminded her that she still existed, that she was still a whole person, even without him. And then, on a page dated November 1989, a name appeared. A name Rebecca had never heard before. Today I went to the library. I don't even know why. Maybe because I needed silence. A place where no one knew me. And there I met Daniel Hayes. He's been working there for years. He helped me find a book. He smiled. A real smile. Not forced. Not interested. Just kind. Rebecca froze. Daniel Hayes. Her mother had met someone who had made her smile again. Someone who had seen her. The next pages of the diary were unlike any other. Catherine wrote about Daniel with a delicacy Rebecca had never seen before. It wasn't overwhelming passion. It wasn't words of desperate love. It was something more subtle, more precious. It was the slow discovery of someone who truly listens to you, who doesn't ask for anything, who simply exists beside you and reminds you that you deserve to be seen. I went back to the library today, Catherine had written in mid-November. I didn't need books, but I wanted to see if he was there, and he was. He was rearranging the shelves in the poetry section. He greeted me as if it were normal for me to be there, as if I'd always been there. We talked about Neruda, how his words can make you feel less alone. He lent me a collection. He said he'd save it for me until I got back. Rebecca felt something tighten inside her as she read. Her mother, that strong, reserved woman who had raised Rebecca with firmness and few words, had been vulnerable. She had been hurt, and she had been saved, at least for a moment, by a man who worked in a library and who brought her poetry. Catherine kept writing about him, how Daniel always made her a cup of coffee when she arrived, how he never asked questions about why she was there so often, how he simply welcomed her, every time, without judgment, without expectations. "He looks at me like I matter," Catherine had written on a page dated December. "I don't know what to do with this. I don't know if it's right. I don't even know if I'm free to feel what I'm feeling. But when I'm with him, the pain eases, and I can breathe." Rebecca turned the page. The tone changed again. Catherine wrote about an afternoon when Daniel had asked her if she wanted to go for a walk after the library closed. They had walked for hours, along the quiet streets of the town, talking about everything and nothing, about books, about trips never taken, about forgotten dreams. Catherine had cried, not out of pain, but out of relief, because someone had finally asked her how she was really feeling, and she had waited for an answer. "He told me I deserved to be happy," Catherine had written. "No one had ever said that to me before. I didn't even think it, but when he says it, I almost believe it." Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. She felt tears running down her cheeks. This was her mother, this woman who wrote about a man who made her believe she deserved happiness. Yet Rebecca had never known anything. She had never known that her mother had been betrayed, that she had left, that she had met someone else. She opened her eyes and continued reading. The following pages told of increasingly frequent encounters, of smiles that lasted longer, of hands that brushed as books were passed around, of silences that were no longer empty, but filled with something left unsaid. Catherine wrote with a tenderness Rebecca had never seen in her mother. It was as if the diary revealed a version of Catherine no one had ever known, a young, frightened version, yet still capable of hope. And then, on a page dated January 1990, there was a sentence that stopped Rebecca in her tracks. "Daniel told me he loves me, not in a romantic way, not in a possessive way. He told me he loves me for who I am, that he doesn't want to change me, that he doesn't want anything from me except to see me happy. And I don't know what to say, because I'm pregnant." Rebecca dropped the diary. She was pregnant. Catherine was pregnant. Pregnant with her. Rebecca quickly did some math. January 1990. She had been born in September of the same year. Her mother had returned to her father. She had returned because she was pregnant. And Daniel Hayes was left behind. Forgotten. Erased. As if he'd never existed. Rebecca sat on the attic floor for hours, her diary open on her knees and her mind racing in 1,000 different directions. Her mother had returned to her father only because she was pregnant, only because she had felt the weight of responsibility, the duty to give Rebecca a family, even if that family was built on fragile and broken foundations. And Daniel Hayes, that man who had loved her in a way that seemed so pure, so selfless, had been left behind. Rebecca continued reading the last pages of the diary. Catherine described the decision in broken words, filled with pain and guilt. "I told Daniel I have to go back," he had written. "Not because I want it, not because I believe things can change, but because a life is growing inside me, and that life deserves a father. It deserves stability. It deserves something more than I can give it alone." Daniel cried. He didn't try to stop me. He just said he understood, that he would wait for me, that if I ever needed him, he would be there. But I know I can't go back. I can't live between two worlds, and so I have to let him go. The last lines of the diary were almost illegible, written in a shaky hand. "I left the library this morning for the last time. Daniel hugged me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. What could I have said? I'm sorry. I love you. Both are true, but they're not enough. They don't change anything." Rebecca closed the diary delicately, as if it were sacred. She sat there, in the silence of the attic, trying to piece together a story she'd never known existed. Her mother had loved someone else. Her mother had made an impossible choice, and she'd carried that burden, that secret, with her all her life, never telling anyone. But a question began to form in Rebecca's mind, insistent and impossible to ignore. Daniel Hayes. Was he still alive? Did he still exist? And if so, did he know Catherine was dead? Rebecca came down from the attic, clutching the diary to her chest. She went into her mother's bedroom and turned on the laptop Catherine rarely used. Her hands shook as she typed the name into the search bar. Daniel Hayes. Portland. Library. The results were meager, but one caught his attention. A local newspaper article dated 5 years earlier mentioned an event organized by the public library of a town called Riverside, about 2 hours from Portland. The event celebrated the retirement of Daniel Hayes, a librarian for over 40 years. There was a photograph, an elderly man with gray hair and round glasses, smiling amidst piles of books. Rebecca zoomed in on the photo. She didn't know what she was looking for. A resemblance to something she knew? A sign? But what she saw was just a man who seemed kind, a man who had spent his life among books, just as her mother would have wanted. He searched again. He found a phone number associated with an address in Riverside. He didn't know if it was still valid. He didn't know if he had the courage to call, but the need to know, to understand, to close the loop his mother had left open, was stronger than the fear. Rebecca picked up the phone. She dialed the number. She waited. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. Then, a voice. A calm, slightly hoarse voice, with the accent of someone who'd spent a lifetime whispering between the stacks of a library. Ready? Rebecca felt her throat tighten. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, in a trembling voice, she said, "Senor Hayes? Daniel Hayes?" There was a pause. Then, "Yes." "Who is speaking?" Rebecca closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. "My name is Rebecca Thompson. I am Catherine's daughter." The silence that followed was so long and so intense that Rebecca thought he'd hung up. But then she heard a breath, a heavy breath, heavy with emotion. And finally, in a voice that seemed about to break, Daniel said, "Catherine." It wasn't a question. It was a whisper, a name spoken like a prayer, like something precious he hadn't dared to say out loud for too long. "She's dead," Rebecca said, and the tears began to flow. 3 weeks ago. "I'm sorry. I know you." He couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in a broken voice, "I know. I heard about it. I saw the obituary in the paper." Rebecca wiped her eyes. "I found her diary. I read about you, about what happened between you. And I need to see her. I need to talk to her. Please." 2 days later, Rebecca found herself in front of a small house on a quiet street in Riverside. It was a modest house, with a manicured garden and a wooden porch lined with potted geraniums. The front door was painted blue. Rebecca stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, gathering the courage to knock. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't even know what she was looking for. Perhaps just confirmation that her mother had been loved, that she had meant something to someone. Finally, she climbed the porch steps and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Daniel had been waiting there. He was older than the photo Rebecca had seen online, but his eyes were the same, kind, sad, filled with an ancient melancholy. When he saw her, Daniel stopped. He looked at her silently, as if he were seeing a ghost. Then his eyes filled with tears. "You have his smile," he whispered. Exactly his. Rebecca felt something snap inside her. Daniel invited her in. The house was exactly as Rebecca had imagined it. Small, quiet, full of books. Shelves everywhere. Books piled on the tables, on the chairs, even on the windowsill. There was a smell of old paper and coffee, a smell that reminded Rebecca of the libraries of her childhood. They sat down in the living room. Daniel offered her some tea. Rebecca accepted, even though she knew she couldn't drink it. Her hands were shaking so badly. They sat in silence for a while. Then Daniel spoke. "Your mother was the bravest person I've ever known," he said, his voice slow and full of emotion. "When I met her, she was broken. Not in the sense that she was weak, but in the sense that someone had betrayed her so deeply that she no longer knew who she was. And I didn't try to fix her. I didn't try to save her. I just listened. I gave her space. And she, slowly, found herself again." Rebecca listened to him in silence, tears running down her cheeks. "I loved her," Daniel continued. "I loved her from the first moment, but I knew she wasn't free. Not completely. And then she told me she was pregnant. And I understood. I understood she had to come back. Not for him, but for you, because she believed you deserved a family, and I couldn't give her that. Not at that moment. Not that way. He paused. He took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I never forgot her. Not a day. Not an hour. I lived my life. I worked. I read. But she was always there, on every page, in every book I recommended to someone. I wondered how she was, if she was happy, if you had grown up well. Daniel stood up and walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer and took out a tin box. He placed it on the table in front of Rebecca. They are letters, these. Your mother wrote to me for years. Not often. Once a year, maybe. Just to tell me she was okay. That you were okay. She sent me pictures. Of you. Of your school plays. Of your graduation. She never stopped thinking about me, and I never stopped thinking about her. Rebecca opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of letters, written in her mother's handwriting, and photographs. Rebecca as a child. Rebecca as a teenager. Rebecca on her graduation day. Her mother had kept Daniel in her life. Silently, from a distance, but she had kept him. Why didn't you ever get back together? Rebecca asked, her voice breaking. Daniel smiled sadly, because she had made a choice, and I respected that choice. And then, time passes. Lives take different paths. But love doesn't die. It changes shape, but it doesn't die. Rebecca sat in Daniel's living room for hours. They talked about Catherine, about memories, about the letters her mother had written over the years. Daniel told her stories Rebecca had never heard, about how her mother loved the rain, how she laughed when he read poetry aloud, how, in those 6 months they'd spent together, Catherine had rediscovered parts of herself she'd thought lost forever. As the sun began to set, and the light in the room dimmed, Daniel got up and went to the kitchen to make more tea. Rebecca followed him with her gaze. There was something profoundly peaceful about that man, a kindness that asked nothing in return, a presence that was unobtrusive, and for the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt she could breathe without her chest aching. When Daniel returned with the steaming cups, he sat back down and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. Until I have a nephew. His name is Owen. He's about your age. He's been through a tough time too. A divorce. Painful. The kind that breaks you in two and leaves you wondering if you'll ever be able to trust anyone again. Rebecca looked up. There was something in the way Daniel talked about it that made her feel less alone, as if grief were something shared, something that connected people instead of separating them. Owen is helping me restore the old family library, Daniel continued. It's been closed for years, but we decided to reopen it. He needs something to devote himself to, something to give him a purpose. And I'm too old to do it alone. He smiled faintly. We'll be there tomorrow afternoon to rearrange the shelves and take inventory. Come by if you like. I'd love for you to see the place. It's where I met your mother. Rebecca was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. She didn't know why, but she felt she had to go. Maybe because it was the last link to her mother's story. Maybe because she needed to see with her own eyes the place where Catherine had found herself. Or maybe she simply had nowhere else to go. The next day, Rebecca drove to the small bookstore in downtown Riverside. It was an old building, with a red brick facade and a dusty window displaying stacks of books covered with white cloths. Above the door was a weathered wooden sign, Hayes & Co., new and used books. Rebecca entered. The bell above the door rang with a soft, melancholy tinkle. The interior was dark, lit only by the sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. It smelled of dust, old paper, and time standing still. And amidst all this, at the back of the shop, a man stood on a ladder, a box of books in his arms. Owen Hayes came down the stairs when he heard the doorbell. He was tall, with slightly disheveled dark hair and a dusty gray t-shirt. His eyes were tired, but not dull, eyes that had seen pain, but hadn't given up. When he saw Rebecca, he paused for a moment, then smiled. A small, almost uncertain smile, but real. You must be Rebecca, he said, putting the box on the floor and wiping his hands on his jeans. My uncle told me about you. Rebecca nodded. And you must be Owen. For a moment they stood there, staring at each other in silence, the dust dancing in the afternoon light. Then Owen pointed to the shelves around them. As you can see, we have a lot of work to do. This place has been closed for 10 years. But Uncle Daniel wants it to come back to life. He says books shouldn't stay in boxes. They deserve to be read. Rebecca looked around. There was something extraordinary about the place. Despite the dust and clutter, it felt alive, full of stories, full of possibilities. "Can I help you?" he said, without even thinking. Owen looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "I have nothing else to do, and I think it would do me good." They spent the afternoon sorting books. They didn't talk much, just brief exchanges about where to put this or that. But there was something comforting in that silence. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a silent understanding. Two people who had suffered. Two people who were trying to rebuild themselves. Two people who, without saying it out loud, understood perfectly what it meant to lose someone and not know how to move on. As the sun began to set, Owen stopped and sat on one of the old wooden stools. Rebecca did the same. He offered her a bottle of water he'd brought with him. She accepted. They drank in silence, watching the golden light filter through the windows. "It's strange," Owen said after a while, "how places can hold so many memories, even when they're not yours." Rebecca looked at him. "What do you mean?" Owen smiled sadly. "This place. It's never really been mine. But when I walk in, I feel something, as if the stories that have passed through here are still here, as if they're waiting for someone to listen." Rebecca nodded slowly. She knew exactly what he meant. The months that followed were unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced. She kept returning to the bookstore. Not every day, but often. Owen was always there, arranging shelves, cataloging books, repairing the old wooden chairs that had been abandoned for years. They spoke little, but that little was enough. They talked about books, about authors they loved, about stories that had saved them when life seemed too difficult to face. They never spoke, at least at first, of their pain. Rebecca didn't tell Owen about Marcus, and Owen didn't tell Rebecca about his divorce. But there was no need. It showed. It showed in the way they both avoided certain questions, in the way they smiled, but not too much, in the way they sometimes stopped, mid-sentence, as if they'd forgotten what they were saying, because a painful thought had caught them by surprise. But over time, something changed. Rebecca began to smile more. She started laughing when Owen told wild stories about the bizarre clients her uncle had had over the years. She began to feel less heavy, less broken, less alone. One evening, as they sat on the library floor surrounded by piles of books, Owen asked her, "What will you do now, when you've finished tidying up your mother's house?" Rebecca thought about it. She didn't have an answer. For weeks, she'd avoided thinking about the future. She'd just lived day by day, trying to survive. But now, sitting there, in that bookcase full of unread stories, she felt something stir inside her. A small spark, an idea. "I do not know," he said slowly, "but I inherited some money from my mother, and I was thinking, maybe I could do something of my own, something she would love." Owen looked at her curiously. "Like what?" Rebecca smiled. "There's an empty space next to this bookstore. I saw it the other day. It used to be an old flower shop, closed for years. But it has big windows, light. It could be, I don't know, a coffee shop, small, quiet, a place where people can come to read, to talk, to exist without haste." Owen smiled. He didn't say anything, but there was something in his eyes, something that resembled hope. 3 months later, Rebecca opened Catherine's Corner, a small coffee shop next to the Hayes bookstore. The walls were painted a light blue, plants everywhere, wooden tables, mismatched but comfortable chairs, and on a special shelf behind the counter was her mother's diary. Rebecca had placed it there, open to a blank page, as if to say the story wasn't over, that there was still room for new chapters. On the opening day, Daniel came. He brought flowers, daisies, simple, delicate, just like the ones Catherine loved. Rebecca placed them in a vase by the window, and when she looked out, she saw Owen crossing the street with a box in his arms. When he entered, he smiled. "I thought you might need some books, for customers." Rebecca rose. More and more books. Owen placed the box on the counter. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, Rebecca understood something. She wasn't ready for new love, maybe not for a long time, but she was ready for something else. She was ready to choose herself, to rebuild herself, to believe she deserved to be happy. That evening, after everyone had left, Rebecca sat alone in the cafeteria. She looked at the daisies in the window. She looked at her mother's diary, and slowly, with hands that no longer trembled, she removed the ring from her finger. She held it in her hand for a moment. Then she placed it in a small box and closed it. Outside, the sun was setting, and through the window, Rebecca saw Owen walking back to the bookstore. He turned. He saw her. He smiled. And she smiled again. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that pain can pave the way for a new beginning, subscribe to the channel. Because every week, I bring true stories of women who have found light after darkness. You are not alone.